Hi, everyone. Welcome my special guest, Jerry Marzinsky, the author of An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower. Fantastic book, phenomenal. Jerry Marzinsky and Sherry Sweeney co-authored this book. Welcome, Jerry.
Glad to be there.
Thank you. I'm so glad to have you here today. I've been looking forward to this interview for so long, and I'm glad that I don't have a hurricane coming through here in Florida today, so we can have this interview. Let me go ahead and read Jerry's bio to everyone. Let me pull that up. So Jerry Marzinsky has a BA. Hold on, sir. Jerry is a retired licensed psychotherapist with over 40 years of experience working with and studying the thought processes of psychotic and criminally insane patients in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in the nation. Jerry is a commercial pilot, certified scuba diver, and long-distance motorcyclist. He has held the positions of second lieutenant in the Arizona Civil Air Patrol and assistant scoutmaster. He was awarded the state of Arizona's Meritorious Awards, I can't talk today, Service Award, and the Pima College Apple Award of Teaching Abnormal Psychology. His formal academic training comprises a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's degree in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program, excuse me. He is the co-author of, as I stated before, An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower, and is currently, has a private practice in Arizona. Everybody, please welcome Jerry. So excited to have you here.
Glad to be here.
So tell us, how did you get started into this field? What made you choose to write this book?
Well, I'd spent many years studying schizophrenics and the voices they heard. And after decades, came to the conclusion that they were not hallucinations. They were far from it. There's a long story behind that. But there was nobody I could talk to about it except schizophrenics. And there were times where I felt I was going crazy myself because of the crazy stuff that was happening. And finally, I met Sherry, and I've known her for 10 years. And then I was telling her about one schizophrenic I was working with that was kind of odd. And she goes, "Oh, I know all about that." I said, "Well, how do you know all about that?" She said, "I heard voices when I was a young woman." And it blew me away because she's probably one of the most spiritual people that I know. And I didn't believe her. So she didn't mention anything like that for 10 years. So I started hitting her with questions that only somebody who was hearing voices would be able to answer. And bam, 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 right down the line, she answered.
Wow.
So it's like, holy cow. And after doing some talking, we went, we got to write a book and let people know about this.
Yep.
And Swedenborg talked about this. The voices, Miguel Ruiz talked about it. And there was a clinical psychologist, Wilson Van Dusen, up in California, worked at a state hospital up there. He also found that these things were separate entities, and he wrote a book about it, but he called them hallucinations. So he would not come out and say, yeah, these things are evil spirits. He talked about them as if they were evil spirits, as if they were conscious. He could carry on conversations with them. They were, kind of rational conversation. They weren't word salad, which is what I thought they would be when I got out of graduate school, because they talked about them like, oh, well, they're hallucinations. And you think, well, hallucinations are all over the place,
Right.
So I thought they would just be word salad. But when I got to after graduate school, I took a job at probably one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet. I think there were about 10,000 patients there when I got there, down from about 30, 20 years before. And that's one of the first things I noticed was I would see them talking and arguing with it looked like it was themselves. But it looked like it was, listening to one side of a telephone conversation. I could hear what they were saying, but I couldn't hear what they were hearing. And it was like, they would wait, there would be a response coming in, and then they would go, no, 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 and they'd start arguing again. And then, no, that's not it. It was clear they were talking to somebody or something that I couldn't hear. So I found it odd, and they didn't want to talk about the voices, and I can't blame them. There's no positive benefits to them talking about the voices. And they get into trouble. People go, "You're weird. You're possessed." Their friends leave them. Their relatives drag them into psychiatrist's office. The psychiatrist drugs them up. They feel like zombies. There's just no positive benefit to them talking about the voices, let alone the voices don't want them talking about them either. So the voices will punish them if they start telling other people about them or what they say. So I didn't know that at the time. But, what I hated about psychology coming up is there was no way I could verify anything they were saying, except in abnormal psychology or in experimental psychology. Okay. So you could go into the rat lab and you could run these session type things and actually see what they predicted to happen was happening. But with the rest of it, like abnormal psychology, they would describe these different mental illnesses, but there was nothing about what to do about them. It was just, they were just, in-depth descriptions of what these things were like. And all the rest. I mean, it was very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate what they were teaching. And what they want is you memorize this stuff and spit it back to us on a test.
Right.
So, there was some stuff you could replicate, but it would take a lot of time and effort. Later, I found out, this was years later, I found out that 80% of what psychologists publish is rubbish. It's not repeatable. They can't replicate it when they go to run the experiment again. So, I saw in graduate school, it was publish or perish. The professor had to publish. They had a knife to their throat. If you don't publish, you're not going to advance.
That happened. I studied literature and philosophy, and it was the same thing, publish or perish. Absolutely.
So they would publish junk. And they would want us to publish junk too. It didn't matter as long as it got published.
Right.
So I didn't know that at the time. But I was real suspicious because I was always suspicious of authority, the way I was raised. And the first time I got to check one of these things out was in clinical psychology or abnormal psychology in undergraduate school. They had us read a paper by a clinical psychologist who wrote that if two crazy people met each other and they both thought they were, Joe Biden, one of them would have to change. Both of them couldn't be Joe Biden. And I'm like, why not? They're both crazy. Why would one of them have to change? Didn't make any sense to me. So, I tucked it in the back of my head and I went, well, okay, I'll remember that. And it was like, maybe 8 years later, I got a chance to check that out. I was doing rounds on the second floor of the psychiatric unit, and I saw this guy talking to himself. He was, arguing with something I couldn't hear. So I tried to creep up behind him to see if I could hear what he was saying, and he caught me. So, I introduced myself. I say, I'm Jerry. I'm the psych for this unit. I haven't seen you before. What's your name? And he goes, I'm Jesus Christ. And I thought a second and I went, no, you're not Jesus Christ because I am. And then I was like, okay, what's he going to do? And he cocked his eyes up and he thought about it a second and he looks at me back in the eye and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he walks off. And I went, okay, so much for that one. So I'm thinking, what other crap did they teach me in there? So it was like I was more on guard now. You
Yeah.
know. And then I guess one of the first things I found was they were teaching everybody in medical school, psychiatry, psychology, counseling, that the voices were hallucinations. Right? So after it took me about a year to figure out how to talk to these guys, because they didn't want to talk about the voices. And the more I learned about them, the easier it was to get them to talk about them, because I went, okay, I know this much about them. What else can you tell me? And they saw I was honest. I was trying to figure out what these things were. They could tell. And I would learn bit by bit by bit, patient by patient by patient. But what was strange is none of the other staff, and there were hundreds of staff there, were the least bit curious about what these voices were or what they were telling these patients. Now, notice that if they were listening to those voices, they would get in trouble. They would act out. They would do stupid stuff. They'd get into fights. They'd get into arguments. So if they were paying attention to the voices, there was a one-to-one correlation between them hearing and listening to the voices and them getting in some kind of trouble. So I was curious, what are these things? What are they hearing?
And how many voices are they hearing? Do they have multiple voices in their head?
They can hear hundreds of voices. They can hear from one or two to hundreds.
Overwhelming.
The ones that hear hundreds are in really bad shape. They're in worse shape than the ones that hear a handful or one or two.
Overwhelming. Yeah.
It is overwhelming. You hear, 100 people screaming at you all at once. Yeah, it's agonizing.
Yeah, you can see how they want to self-medicate. Even if they weren't in an institution receiving medication, they would want to be out on the street self-medicating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Anything to kind of dull those things.
Yeah.
But that makes it worse. So I lost more control that way. But one of the first patterns I saw when I started talking to them was the voices were completely negative. They would say stuff like, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're crazy, nobody likes you. People are laughing at you, they're plotting behind your back, they're going to kill you. It was always negative stuff. It was consistently, unswervingly negative. There wasn't any, and if there was even the least bit of positive mixed in there, it was only to get their trust so they can turn on them later. So I'm like, why would a hallucination be consistently negative? Right. Why isn't this random like all other hallucinations? And it wasn't. They were consistently negative. So I'm like, why is that? What is holding them on such a negative course all the time? Something was doing that. Something was stopping them from being random like all other hallucinations. The second thing I found in talking to them is that they were anti-religious. One guy came in and he said, when I prayed the 23rd Psalm, the voices act like they're being thrown on a hot frying pan. They hate it. And I went, well, that's interesting. So what I started doing was handing out the 23rd Psalm to some of my other schizophrenics and say, when the voices come, say this and then come on back in a week and tell me what happened. The voices consistently hated it.
Interesting.
So then I started asking, well, what happens with the voices when you go to church? And that broke down into three classifications. One, if the voices were weak, the voices would shut up when they went into church. They just go quiet. If they were of moderate strength, they get louder and try to mock the preacher, say bad things about him, say this is all garbage, and get loud and block the patient from hearing anything the preacher had to say. If they were very strong, they would drive them out of the church. They would get up and run out of the church. They couldn't deal with it.
Any violence towards other people when that would happen? Or they would just run out?
They would just run out.
Okay.
They didn't attack. And you hear time to time they attack preachers. It's the voices that do that. But they were also attacking the psychiatrists. I didn't know what was causing those attacks at the time. I figured it out after 7 years. But why would a hallucination be anti-religious?
Right.
So the patterns kept, and if the voices are running patterns, they're not hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run predictable patterns. They're all over the place. So what psychiatry is telling us about there being hallucinations is a bunch of crap. They haven't done any studies on those voices at all. You know, they just, like the Egyptian priests of old, they just went, well, we hereby pronounce that the voices are hallucinations, and that's all there was to it, without any evidence whatsoever. They haven't done one study on it. They haven't any, matter of fact, one schizophrenic, when I was at the state hospital, he got upset. I was asking questions about his voices, or his voices got upset. And he went to the psychiatrist and complained that I was asking him questions about his voices, and he didn't like it. Next morning, I ended up in the psychiatrist's office being told, ordered, you will not ask these patients about their voices. You know, they're hallucinations, and by asking them about them, forcing them, and you're making them worse.
And it seems like to me, on listening to you, it's like you're actually doing your job to find out what the voices are and then trying to get that information, you know,
Well, not according to him.
crazy.
So that happened twice, and they threatened me that if they caught me again, I'd be in serious trouble. So I really had to tone it down at the state hospital, because I think part of it was, you know, schizophrenics were beating up psychiatrists at a horrendous rate. They were being attacked more often than any of the other staff out there. They were being attacked more often than psych nurses, than counselors, than doctors, than dentists. The only people who got attacked anywhere near as much as they did were attendants that worked on the wards with these people 24 hours a day. So I was wondering for years, like, what are they saying to these guys in 20 minutes? Because they wouldn't spend any more than 20 minutes with them a month. You know, they come in, how's your medications working? They're not working. Okay, let me increase them, decrease them, add more, take some away, cut these off, try. It was just like a, you know, merry-go-round. They would just add medications, take them away. It was always medications. It was time talking to these people at all. You know, just readjusting and adjusting their medications all the time. So something that kind of worked. You know, so you know, that was a puzzle to me. It took me 7 years to figure that one out. But the patterns kept coming. But I had to be very careful not to piss off any of the schizophrenics, so they wouldn't go to the psychiatrist again and say he's asking us questions about the voices. So you know,
Excuse me.
I was curious because I didn't know what these things were. You know, I didn't think they were hallucinations, but I didn't know what they were. And as the patterns kept increasing. Now, the other thing I saw was that they would consistently go off their medications at some time. You know, and it was like, I remember one time I was on the first floor of the psychiatric unit. There was a two-tiered stepway up to the second floor. So there, you know, and the banister was a hollow pipe going up to the second floor, but the cap at the top of the banister was cut off, so it was just a hollow pipe going down. So yeah, I saw that. I didn't think anything of it. Then one day I was walking down the first floor, and here was one of the maintenance men had a steel cutter with, you know, revolving wheel on it, and he was cutting off the cap on the bottom floor. And there were sparks flying all over the place, and there was smoke, and a bunch of the patients stopped to watch. So I just joined them, and I was right in there with them and watching all the sparks. And it was like the most exciting thing going on right then. So I stopped and I was watching. And then the cap fell off. And what fell out was hundreds and hundreds of pills. There was smoke, there was sparks, and then these pills started pouring out like a waterfall. All these multicolored pills. The patients had been dumping them in that top banister for decades.
Oh my God, how funny.
And they hit the floor and they just spread all over the place like a bunch of cockroaches. And there were hundreds of them. And I looked at them, and a lot of them were antipsychotic drugs. So I'm like, you know, each one of those pills was a vote to stay crazy. And I'm like, why did they do that? You know, why were they throwing away their medications, the drugs that kept them sane? Why is this happening? It was wild. So that was another puzzle. So what I noticed is sooner or later, virtually every schizophrenic on my caseload went off their medication, and they went nuts. You know, I'd get called out to the vocational classes and go, you know, Sally's disturbing the class. She's speaking to voices. She's running around. She's threatening people. Or you better get over here and do something with her. I mean, this happened over and over and over again. So I started asking after they got back on their meds again and they were stable. I'd pull them in and I go, "Why'd you go off your meds?" And they went, "Oh, because of the side effects. The side effects are awful." You know, granted, they were terrible. You know, they were toxic. These meds were toxic, and those were the toxic side effects of them. You know, dry mouth, sexual dysfunction, you're feeling like a zombie, not being able to concentrate, horrible side effects. I mean, pages of them. And so I started asking them. I pulled them in. "Why'd you go off your meds?" "Well, the side effects. I hate the side effects." "Well, what's worse, the side effects or being crazy?" So I went to the DSM and I copied down all the, you know, characteristics of paranoid schizophrenia. You know, hearing voices, seeing demons, nightmares, paranoia, people laughing at you, you know, feeling like you're going to die, the voices threatening you. I mean, just like a page and a half. And I put them as checks, you know, so check each one. So I'd ask them, I'd give them the sheet of paper. I said, "Write down every side effect that you experienced from your medication," because they weren't all the same. They all didn't have the same side effects. So, you know, they'd write down a handful of side effects. And then I'd give them the two sheets, the check sheet. And I said, "Okay, check each one of these symptoms that you experienced when you went nuts." You know, so they check a bunch of them. Then I'd take both of them and I'd give them back to them and I'd say, "Which one is worse?" Every single one of them said going crazy was worse. So I said, "Well, why'd you stop your meds?" Their answer was, "I don't know." For 3 solid years. "I don't know. I don't know. I
But
don't
they've
know."
been hijacked.
They didn't know. You know, they really didn't know.
Yeah.
So the last year, there was one gal, she was doing good in cosmetology class, making good grades. Sharp when she was taking her meds. She was, you know, she would have made a good, you know, hair cutter. She would have left the rehabilitation center with a license, a cosmetology license. But because she went off her meds a third time, if they did that, there was a rule we would discharge her. Because if they couldn't stay on their meds there when they were being handed to them, they certainly weren't going to stay on them outside when they weren't being handed to them and they had to go get them from somewhere. So we were about to discharge her, and I called her mother and said, "You know, we're sending her out. She went off her meds the third time. We can't trust her to stay on her meds." And the mother begged me. I mean, she said, "Please don't. I can't handle her down here. She gets crazy. I'll come up there and we'll talk to her and we'll find out why she went off her meds." So I said, "Okay, you know, come on up." She came up one Friday afternoon, and both of us are sitting there. Brought the patient in, closed the door, and asked her, "Why did you go off your meds?" And, you know, she said, "You won't believe me." And her mother and I are both, you know, urging her. Her mother's begging her to tell me why she went off her meds. And I'm like, "Tell me." She said, "Well, you won't believe me." You know, I told her, I said, I've heard a lot of weird stuff here since I got here. I don't think you're going to tell me anything that's going to freak me out. You know, and she went on, she goes, "Because the voices were telling me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me, and they were pointing to all the toxic side effects. And they were telling me that look at what you're feeling. You're being poisoned." And in effect, she was. I mean, those were toxic side effects of those medications. You know, they were not good for her. With long-term use, they would kill her neurological system. They'd shrink the brain. They'd destroy the peripheral nervous system. You know, and they were finding that out by doing autopsies on patients who were in the state hospital for years. Their brains were shrunk like walnuts. And when the researchers who were doing the autopsy published that information, the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts. And, "Oh no, it's not our medications, it's the schizophrenia that's doing that," you know.
Right. It's a chemical imbalance. I mean, they're going to start saying everything.
That was a whole other area there.
Right. Chemical imbalance, neurotransmitter malfunction, or whatever they want to use for that.
So the researchers went back and started feeding those neuroleptic drugs to rats and monkeys and mice, and their brain shrunk. So they went, no, it's not schizophrenia. It's your drugs that are doing this. But I've never heard a single psychiatrist ever tell a patient how dangerous these drugs were. They'd say, oh, well, they make you groggy, your vision might be blurred for a while, your mouth might be dry, you might feel a little sedated for a while, but they would never tell them what the dangerous side effects were. They would wait until they appeared, and then they would give them cogentin to mask those negative side effects while they were still rotting out the patient's brain, but they weren't able to feel it because they were on this mask that kind of hid that from, so
Right.
it suppressed the symptoms while the destruction was still going on. So it dawned on me after 7 years. I found that out. I went, well, that's why the psychiatrists are getting the crap kicked out of them after 20 minutes, is the voices are telling the patient to attack them because they're being poisoned. Now I heard patients say that before. I think the psychiatrist is poisoning me. So I'm virtually certain that was what's happening to them, because in 15 or 20 minutes, what are they going to say to the guy that pisses them off bad enough to be attacked?
Right.
So the second thing I noticed was, like you said, this chemical imbalance bullcrap. And so I was with the patients a lot of time when the psychiatrist was determining which medication to give them. And after a while, I noticed that they never gave them any kind of test to determine a baseline of which neurotransmitters were out of balance or by how much. So if it was a neurochemical imbalance, it would seem to be necessary to find out which neurotransmitters are out of balance or by how much. I'm like, well, where's your test? What do you use for a test? How do you tell which neurotransmitters are out of balance or by how much, or what to do about them? And the psychiatrist answered, oh, we don't worry about that. We let the pharmaceutical industry worry about that. They tell us which drugs are used for which, I'm like, what?
No, it's like putting a blindfold on and throwing a dart.
It's ridiculous. So it turned out that they have no objective test for a chemical imbalance. They don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be, let alone the imbalance. And now it's come out years ago that there is no chemical imbalance of the brain. They can't find one. So it's another lie.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So it's lie after lie after lie after lie. And the next one was the DSM. Their the directory of psychiatric illnesses.
Right. The diagnostic manual, what is it? Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Right.
Right.
So they got almost 300 of them now. And this is one of the biggest frauds perpetuated upon the public by the psychiatric mafia that there ever was. Their DSM, or psychiatry's fabricated Bible of mental illnesses, one of the biggest scams perpetuated on the planet. Every single one of those is made up. There is not a objective test for any of the 297, I think they have now, any of those illnesses. There's no objective test. It's all subjective. 2/3 of the psychiatrists who are on the board that make up these mental illnesses are in league with Big Pharma.
And the legal system, I have to say, when I was younger, I worked in a law firm. It was family law, and the main attorney there would use, at this time, it was DSM-3, would use that in a court of law.
Yeah, they use it for
Get
that.
these psychological evaluations, right? So, I mean, it's in the legal system too.
Oh yeah, and it's a bunch of crap.
Yeah.
Basically every single one of those mental illnesses were fabricated by breaking up segments of human behavior and pathologizing them.
Right.
There are no blood tests, there are no lab tests, there's no x-rays, EEGs to validate a single one of those diagnoses. There's no objective test whatsoever. They're just classes of behaviors that a group of psychiatrists had voted in to be a mental disorder. That was said by a psychiatrist himself. They have impressive looking labels. They look like they're scientific.
Right.
And one fellow who attended one of those meetings said that it seemed like a tobacco barn auction. You know, they come, hey, I got a new mental illness. These are the symptoms, you know, and then these 2/3, I guess, would sit back and go, oh, can we make a drug to treat that? You know,
Oh,
they voted in or they voted out, you know. So, you know, it's a bunch of garbage. You know, they got some of these diagnoses are that are in there now, mathematics disorder. If you're bad at math, you don't like math, you got a mathematics disorder. Caffeine intoxication disorder. You drink too much coffee, you're disordered, buddy.
right here.
You got a psychiatric diagnosis. Well, I got the mathematics disorder. Sibling relational disorder. Okay, so if kids are fighting, they got a relational disorder.
Oh my God.
You know, homosexuality in the DSM-2, sexual orientation disturbance. They took that out because of the this gay pride stuff. You know, they didn't like that, so they voted that one out. Florence syndrome, being overwhelmed by beauty, such as in Florence, Italy. It's characteristic by fainting and dizziness, and they recommend treating it with antidepressants.
Oh my God.
Paris syndrome, mostly suffered by Japanese patients visiting France for the first time. Symptoms include depression, anxiety, feelings of persecution. You know, in my day, they would have called it culture shock.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's really funny. I mean, it's like, how can you take it seriously? That really is clown world.
Well, it's clown world, but that's what they're using in hospitals. That's what they're using in psychiatry. That's what they're using in insurance. That's what they're using in the courts. And it's all a bunch of crap.
It's incredible.
It's just a description of behaviors, you know, a class of behaviors, and they pathologize it. I remember when I was studying abnormal psychology, I went, well, I got that, and I got that, and I got that, and I got that, and I got that. You know, everybody has segments of these things.
Yeah, I remember I loved psychology when I was in college, and I remember they used to call it doctor's disease. When you start reading the different descriptions, you feel like, oh my God, I have that. You know,
Yeah,
like you have an aspect of it. Absolutely.
yeah. So they're perpetuating this nonsense. So, you know, in 1952, the DSM-1 had 106 psychiatric diagnoses. By 1980, the DSM-2 went up to 256. So they're making them up as they go along. DSM-5 has now 297, and their numbers are climbing with every single meeting of this group. There is no scientific way to determine any of these things. You know, they're used for insurance purposes. You know, you got to put a diagnosis for them to pay it. Another scam. They perpetuated that scam on the entire Western world.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's such a farce what they've done, you know, and they're traumatizing people, especially, you know, young kids. They just want to go out and be hyper and have a really good time. And they get stigmatized with these, what is it? What is that hyper? Was it HD?
HDHD.
HDHD. Yeah, they get stigmatized with that just for being a kid
These
and
are
medicated.
These are statistics from 2017 on kids. These are old statistics. They're much higher than this now. Back in 2017, there were more than 7.2 million kids on psychiatric drugs. You know, over 622,000 of these kids were under the age of 5. Over 80,000 of them were on ADHD drugs. These are amphetamines.
I can't even imagine that.
Over 38,000 are on antidepressants. Over 85,000 are on antipsychotics. These are the antipsychotic drugs that shrink your brain. They cause neurological damage.
Mm.
Over 389,000 were on anti-anxiety drugs. So they don't care. Yeah, they don't care. They're making what is it? What should they make on these things? Here it is here. Antidepressant drugs. They're expected to reach $15.98 billion in sales by 2023. We're billion. We're not talking million. We're talking almost $16 billion
And I'm
selling
sure, I'm
in the
sorry,
US alone.
I can just imagine, and post-COVID, because so many people, if they were in a state that was locked down, I'm sure they were incredibly depressed, you know?
Yeah,
Suicide rates went up. People were actually depressed at that time, you
yeah.
know?
Suicide rates climbed. Now the
Yeah.
global antipsychotic sales hit 14.54 billion in 2021, and they're expected to reach 15.5 billion by 2022. Money, money, money. That's all they're after is money. None of these drugs cure anything. They just suppress symptoms.
Mm.
So, you know,
Ridiculous.
it's lie after lie after lie, deception after deception after deception. So, you know, they started off with blaming women for psychosis. You know, the kids getting schizophrenia. Well, the mothers did something.
Right.
You know, the mothers did this or the mothers did that, or and the mothers went, well, what did we do? You know, we didn't do anything. You know, what we do? You know, that was observable. You know, so they dropped that, and what they did is they bumped it upstairs to genetics. This is where people couldn't see for themselves what was going on. You'd have to be a geneticist. So they're going, oh well, it's a genetic disorder because there seems to be a correlation between maybe the parents being psychotic and the parents and some of the kids being psychotic. So correlation doesn't mean causation. You know, you could say all schizophrenics drink milk, so milk causes schizophrenia. That's basically what they were doing.
Yeah. Not
Saying,
good.
blaming the mothers, well, there must be a correlation here. It doesn't mean causation. So what they did is they kicked it upstairs to genetics. So now you couldn't see anything. You can't see genes. The average person can't see what's going on. You know, only the geneticists could. And a lot of them weren't interested in studying schizophrenia. So they got away with that for who knows, decades or more. And, you know, teaching, well, it's a genetic disorder and da 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 da. And then the geneticists finally got around to taking a look at it and they go, hey, we don't see any genetic marker for schizophrenia. You know, what are you talking about? It's
Interesting.
not there. Until they come back and they go, well, it's not just one gene. It's 100 genes all interacting like there, and then well, we know it's the genes, and we'll eventually figure it out. Just trust us, you know. So more bullshit. Yeah.
Trust me, I'm in a white coat.
So yeah, you know, the one that was
Yeah.
like the geneticists are saying we don't see it. You know, we don't see it. So now they had to find something else because they didn't have an explanation. They didn't have a cause. They didn't know what it was. The honest psychiatrist would, when you ask them, well, what causes schizophrenia, they'd say, we don't know. And there were a handful of honest psychiatrists out there. The majority of them would say it's a biological disorder
Mm.
because they started that in the 70s. And it was started by a drug company by the name of Eli Lilly when they came out with Prozac. They,
Oh,
they didn't have any reason why it worked. They didn't know why it worked. So they figured, well, we have to make up some reason why it works so we know, people think we know what's going on. So they made up this biochemical imbalance stuff. You know, they went, well, our drug is a chemical and it must affect other chemicals in the body, and it must be chemical because they seem to feel, you know, a lot of them seem to feel a little better when they take it. So it must be a chemical stuff. So, you know, they came out with it. They knew it was a lie at the time. You know, they knew it was a deception at the time, but they went with it anyway, and they published it. And they went, well, it's a serotonin imbalance. So, you know, decades later, they found, well, there is no serotonin imbalance with depression. You know, it's not there. So that didn't hold any water. And then they found that there was no biochemical imbalance at all. There was no evidence for it. So
and then
there was another freaking lie that they're perpetuating to sell their drugs. It's money, money, money. They don't want people getting any better, any mentally healthy. They want to sell their drugs. That's what they want. They want to sell their psychiatric services. You come in and pay them $200 for a visit to prescribe these drugs for you. And then you go to the pharmacist and he gets paid off. The drug companies get paid off. The whole caboodle gets paid off when you get a psychiatric illness. They don't want you getting better. And if you look at the statistics for how much the government is spending on schizophrenic research, it was a pittance. It was so low they were embarrassed. So did they increase the amount? No. What they did is they manipulated the statistics to make it look like they were spending more money by taking major categories out, and putting the ones that they were spending money in there. So it looked like they were spending a lot more money on it, but they actually weren't. They do not want a cure. They don't make any money from the cure.
No, they want us sick. They want us sick and dumbed down.
Yep. And you can see what they're doing with the kids. They want you dumbed down.
Yeah.
So what they did is they come up with this chemical imbalance crap. And that's where I noticed that at the state hospital, they had no baseline. They were taking no baselines. So if they didn't have a baseline, how'd they know what was out of balance by how much? They didn't. They still don't. They don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be. I mean, it was ridiculous.
And this comes into where they say practicing medicine, they're just practicing, they're experimenting on a captive audience. If someone's in an institution, and they're there to get help, they're being victimized. Not only do they have this parasitic entity, but now they've got this drug, big pharma coming after them, just to experiment, make money off of them.
And you look at our television, you turn on the television, every other commercial is a drug commercial. They don't allow that in Europe. It's against law. So the pharmaceutical industry has bought off Congress. They bought off the politicians. The Jewish lobby has bought them off also.
Yeah.
They're not working for us. So here they are graduating thousands of psychiatrists every year with this falsity that this is a biochemical imbalance. And then you look at the suicide rate in the US, 50,000 people, close to 50,000 people kill themselves every year. And a large portion of them are on antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs. So you have more psychiatrists, you have more psychologists, you have more psychiatric drugs on the planet now than ever in the history of mankind. And we have a population that's sicker than it ever has before. The prisons are full of psychiatric patients, the psychotic patients. The mental health centers are overflowing. They can't handle them all. The ER is full of them all the time. The private hospitals are full of them all the time. And they're just dosing them down with these drugs that aren't curing anything. And then you look at the suicide rate for schizophrenics. It's 3 to 5 times that of the average population. So the schizophrenics are in bad shape. But you look at the suicide rate of psychiatrists, and it's right up there. It's like a couple of tenths of a point less than schizophrenics. They're suiciding at about the same rate as their most mentally ill patients.
Do they see it? Do you think that they see it for the farce that it is?
No.
No? Why do you think the suicide rate's high for the psychiatrists?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think one, it's the realization that they're really not helping anybody. These people, nobody's being cured. They're coming back in. They're saying these medications don't work. I'm feeling worse than I did before. Well, try this one. And then they come back in. It's really not helping. Well, try this one. And that one isn't helping. You got that going on. And, plus I think they're being attacked by the negative entities that are possessing the schizophrenics. Okay. They're being attacked and murdered at a rate much higher than in virtually any other doctor, I think, except dentists who suicide at a pretty high rate.
Interesting.
So
I'm sorry to hear that, because I know that, they definitely didn't start out that way. They wanted it, they joined that profession to help people.
Yeah, I think a majority of them did. They and then they find they're trapped there.
Right.
They got all these years of education, they're in the field, they got their practice, and now they're trapped.
Yeah, then it's like you feel like you want to get a
Permanently.
refund on your education after that when you find out that there's so many lies, you know?
Tell you, I did, so, once I got out of the state hospital, I where did I go? I worked at mental health centers, I worked at, clinics, I worked at, the state hospital. And I got a job in the psychology department of the Arizona State Prison. And it was there I was really able to experiment with the schizophrenics. So what I had was a group of schizophrenics around me all the time who we had an agreement that I would do everything I could to help them out if they would tell me in real time what their voices were telling them. So I didn't have to worry about psychiatrists coming after me there, because if one of the prisoners went, they had a skewed view of prisoners anyway. They viewed them all as liars. You couldn't trust anything they said. They were kind of semi-human. They just, it was like, that's just the way the culture is in there.
Right.
So I always had a group of 10 or 17 of them that I would see on a regular basis, and the agreement was that while we were working together, if the voices showed up, they would tell me in real time what the voices were telling them. Okay, so I was getting these updated reports from a number of them all the time, and they were different ones. They would kind of come and go. As some were released, I'd get different ones in, but the patterns were the same. The patterns I was finding were the same among all of them, and more patterns were coming out. So I have published on my website under jerrymarzinsky.com. You go to articles, and there's a list of 23 of these patterns there. And if you're working with schizophrenics, if you have a schizophrenic daughter or son, go there and look, and you'll see these patterns. They're right there in front of your eyes. And again, I want to repeat, if the voices are running patterns, they're not hallucinations. There's something that's driving those patterns. There's something that's keeping them on those patterns. They are not random. They're running fixed, unswerving patterns. What holds them on those patterns?
And they're negative.
Yep, they're negative.
They're negative, right?
They're all negative. They're out to destroy the person. So let me see, where was I going with that? I was experimenting with the prisoners. So as these patterns emerged, I started wondering, well, what would happen if I started throwing a monkey wrench in the patterns? So what I would do is I'd give these prisoners homework to do, and I'd bring them back the next week, and I'd say, well, how did the voices react to what you did this week? And they go, what? They didn't like it. They don't want me coming back here. They think you're crazy. They think you're a fool. They told me not to come here. They were screaming at me all the way here. They don't want you. They don't like you, and they don't want me coming here. And I said, well, they're saying you're an asshole. You're crazy. And I said, well, you have to go tell them to go stick their head in the toilet. It was like, so, I would have, those kind of conversations with the voices, and usually it would be the voices attacking them while they were in my office. And they would come back, and all of them would say, the voices don't like what you're doing. They don't want me coming here. They don't want me doing this stuff. They're making me miserable when I do this stuff. One of those things was the 23rd Psalm. How they react to, they hated the 23rd Psalm. Consistently, they hated it. Like, what kind of hallucination would hate the 23rd Psalm? Why would a hallucination even care?
Right.
Hallucination isn't even conscious. These things were conscious. They were aware. They were aware of what was going on around them. They were aware of when they could attack these people at opportune times. They were aware of what I was saying. They were aware of what the patient was saying. They were perfectly aware. They were conscious. But I didn't want to admit that to myself. It was like, yeah, it must be something with their subconscious mind going on here. So as I went on, finding more and more things to interfere with these patterns, the voices started reacting in different ways. There was one guy, as he left my office, he stopped in the doorway and he said, you understand that what you're doing is dangerous, don't you? And I just looked at him and was like, no, it never crossed my mind, you know. And he just turned around and walked away. I didn't answer him. I just stayed quiet. Then I just looked at him and went, what's with that? And then he turned around, didn't say anything else. And I'm going, thinking to myself, well, the voices are stuck in his head. They're not, they can't come out. They're stuck there. They can't get in me. I wasn't worried about it. So I kept experimenting and finding more and more things that would disrupt their patterns that they didn't like. So then they started coming back and saying that they don't want us coming here anymore. Let me see, what else were they saying? Yeah, it was they were all coming back saying the voices don't like you, they don't want us coming here anymore, they don't want us doing these things. But they came anyway. So then one guy, after we finished the session, and dealing with the voices, and they were starting to get weaker, he turned around the doorway and he said, you know what you're doing is dangerous. And so that was like a shot across the bow. I just kept going. And then one of the guys I was working with knocked on my door one day. I don't know how he got into the medical unit. And he goes, I opened the door and he goes, the voices want to talk to you. And he said, they want to talk to me personally. That had never happened before. In 20 years working with these guys, never did they talk to me directly. They always talked through the patient if they talked at all. And so I said, well, okay, come on in. And sat down, closed the door, and I said, well, what do they got to say? These words came out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. My head went boom.
I could only
My
imagine.
denial system completely broke down. I mean, it was like, and then I went, well, tell them this. And the patient, the prisoner said, I don't have to tell them anything. They can hear what you're saying. They can see what you're doing. I didn't know that. That kind of surprised me.
Right.
So that was like a 1-2 punch. It was like, I was like, after he left, I closed the office. I didn't see anybody the rest of the day. I was recovering from that, but that didn't stop me. I kept going. And, I stumbled in, another pattern I saw this at the state hospital, was when the voices attacked these people, their energy level went down to nothing. They didn't have the energy.
Like an energy vampire, right?
Yes.
Interesting.
They would suck their energy.
Well, that's
and
part of that demonic entity, that loosh that they
Yes.
talk about.
It was consistent. It was consistent. Every time the voices would attack him, their energy would drop down to nothing. One guy told me it felt like he was digging in a hot ditch in the hot sun all day. That's what he felt like when he got up in the morning. But what he was doing was just tossing and turning all night, and he wasn't using any much physical energy. But all of them would say that there was a 1-to-1 correlation between the voices attacking and their energy level being depleted.
It must be exhausting to fight against that if you have that internal struggle going on.
Well,
like if they're fighting against the voice inside their head, that intrusive voice, that must take a lot of energy to try and fight back.
Well, some of them didn't realize that the voices were something separate from them. They thought it was themselves. So you can't fight back against themselves. And
That's
they were
true.
drained. So whether they realized it or not, they were being drained, and it was consistent. So I started looking into that, and so they in order for them to recover, they have to realize that the voices aren't who they are. They're something separate. So they have to have something to fight against or to resist. The second thing is they need to know these things are parasites. Those were the two things that I put across to all the ones I was working with. And, I did a study on it, 1 to 10. I actually asked them, how much energy do you have on a scale of 1 to 10? before the voices attacked, and how much did you have on a scale of 1 to 10 after they attacked. And after I had about 30 of those, we ran an analysis of variance on it, and it was statistically significant. There was
Yeah.
a phenomena there. So they didn't, a lot of them didn't seem to realize it. So I'd ask them, how did you feel after the voices attacked? How was your energy level? Well, I was in the dumps. Well, how'd you feel before? Well, I felt better before. I'm like, well, where do you think your energy went? They would go, well, I don't know. I'd say, well, if you stuck your hand in a fire 100 times and each time you got burnt, what was burning you? They didn't have any trouble saying the fire. But I said, well, the voices, you've heard these voices for years, you've heard them for decades. Every time they came, you were drained of energy, right? Well, yeah, I guess so. Looking back on it. Well, then what was draining your energy? Well, I don't know. They were being blocked from saying. Every once in a while, one would say, the voices, like they just caught on.
Yeah.
But the voices went nuts when I would tell them that. They did not want the patient knowing that they were vampires, energy vampires.
That is wild. That is wild. I mean, and think of how many people are in these institutions and just out on the street.
Yeah.
It can happen to anybody at any time.
Yep. And a lot of them are on the streets because they can't take care of themselves. They can't work. So they shut down all the state hospitals. So it's cheaper to treat them in the state hospital than it is in the state prison because you're paying for all that security, all that security equipment,
Right.
the barbecue, it's much more expensive to keep them in state prison. But how are they going to live? They can't work. They're hearing voices. They can't concentrate. They can't get anything done. So they start selling drugs or they start stealing stuff. And then they end up in state prisons instead of going to a state hospital. So they spend, 10, 20 years in the state prison. They come out ice cold, no feelings, just hardened. And graduate criminals, it's like a graduate school for criminals.
Right.
The recidivism rate is between 50 and 75%. They're not doing anything to help these people.
Did you ever discover how these entities first enter these people? Like where it began in their personal history? Because I'm sure everyone's different, but how did you ever?
Where it usually
discover that?
begins with some kind of very nasty trauma, either severe sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. Okay, is the biggest one. It's like that abuse just cracks open the psychic field and they just get in there.
Mhm.
The other one, the other big one is amphetamine. The same shit they're feeding the kids.
Oh my God.
Amphetamine just opens people up like, nothing. I mean, I've seen more prisoners go psychotic on amphetamines than any other drug ever. And
Amazing.
it starts like they start using it and they're feeling great. They're feeling like Superman. They stayed up for 3 nights and they're still feeling like Superman. And then they start hearing voices. And they go, oh, well, that's just a hallucination. And then they come down and it goes away. And they go, well, see, it was a hallucination. It went away. And that made it happen 10, 20, 25, 30 times and it goes away. And then one day it doesn't. And the voices are with them solid from then on out. So they're just as crazy as the ones that, went crazy by some other means.
Right.
And the voices never go away. They won't go away. So they're right in there then. Amphetamine is a very, very dangerous drug. And it's coming across the borders right now by the ton.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they have all the kitchens in the United States also, not just coming over the border. They're cooking it here too. It's awful. It's the worst drug of them all.
Yeah, it is.
And then they glamorized it in Breaking Bad.
Oh, for crying out loud.
You
I never watched that. I didn't know that. But boy, that's Hollywood for you. The demonic influence in Hollywood.
Yeah, they even tried to have kids' toys from that series.
Oh, for crying out loud.
I know.
How sick.
Yep.
So that one voice came through that day and you know, it said, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. You know, and that shook me up. It was then to my denial system completely caved in. I mean, with anybody else who had as much evidence as I had by that point, they would have come to that conclusion years ago. But no, not me. You know, it's like, oh, there can't be demons. There must be something wrong with their subconscious mind. No, it was clear that these things were conscious. They were aware. They were aware of what I was doing. You know, they didn't like it. They made it clear. You know, so the next one that happened was I was reading a book by Miguel Ruiz where he was talking about these things as uh, energy parasites.
Mm,
You know, so I'm like, wow, he sees it too.
yeah.
I mean, he was a Southern South American shaman, and you know, I'm like, wow, you know, he sees it too. Here it is. He sees it too. Swedenborg saw it. Um, so I brought that book into the prison, and one of the prisoners I was working with, I brought him into my office and I said, I want to read you this paragraph, and I want to know what you think about it, because I was always asking him questions. And so I went to read the paragraph, and I got to the part where um, he was talking about the voices being energetic parasites. Okay? The guy I was talking to was hearing voices. You know? So he's generally pretty pleasant until his voices took over. And after I got done reading, I looked at him, and he's sitting there like a zombie. I mean, he's just staring straight ahead, and he's looking at me with this weird look. And I'm like, I got a sneaking feeling he's going to attack. So I
Ugh.
pushed my chair against the wall. So my feet were facing him. So if he came at me, he wouldn't knock me over. I was back by the wall, and I could kick him off and, you know, put myself in that position. He's just staring at me the whole time. He doesn't say anything. And then I hear this electrical crackling erupt behind my head. It sounded just like an arc welder. It was a crack, 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 loud crack. And it started moving up the right-hand wall of my office, and crackling, crack, 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 all the way up to the ceiling. I didn't want to take my attention completely off of him because I didn't know what he was going to do. He was looking weird.
Yeah.
So I was kind of bouncing my attention back and forth between him and the crackling to see if I could see anything. It sounded just like an arc welder. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't smell anything. And I couldn't taste anything, but I could hear it, and it was moving, you know, crackling
Yeah.
all the way to the ceiling. Then this lasted like 25 seconds. I mean, it wasn't short. It wasn't like a little 5-second blur. It went on and on and on. And then it went across the ceiling, all the way across the room, and I was able to keep him in full view while it was crossing over him. And then it started coming down the left-hand ceiling, and it's coming right near me there. And then it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can right by my left leg, and it started crackling. You know, it's like it was crackling the whole time, but it's crackling in the trash can. I bend over and I look in there. There's nothing there. There's not even a piece of paper in there. The inmate porter had cleaned it the night before. There was nothing in there, and it was still crackling. And then boom, it went out just like that. And I'm like shocked. I mean, like, I'm in shock. And I look at him, and I asked him, "Did you hear that?" He doesn't say anything. He gets up and he goes, "Oh, I gotta leave." And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, go, get out of here, go." So he left, and then I got up after he left, and I'm inspecting the walls to see if there's any burn marks or anything, because it sounded like electricity. I couldn't see anything. There was no evidence that it ever happened. I couldn't tell anybody anything because, you know, I was thinking I'm going crazy.
Right.
You know?
They might
So,
try and medicate you. I'm just kidding.
yeah, they might, or I couldn't say anything. I
Right.
couldn't talk to any of the other psych staff. Um, so I kept it to myself. I couldn't talk to anybody. And here's all these weird things building up, and I couldn't talk to anybody about it. The only people who understood it were the schizophrenics. You know, I could talk to them about this kind of stuff, but nobody else. Not even my wife. She'd go, "What are you picking in the heads of those crazy people anyway? You shouldn't be doing it." You know, so I'm like, okay, all right. You know, I don't need that on top of all this other crap that I'm dealing with. So I couldn't talk to her at all. So Sherry was the first one I was able to talk to about this stuff. You know,
Yeah.
we decided to write that book about how we came to the conclusion. So about 4 months later, I called him back 3, 4 months later because I didn't want to see him. I didn't I didn't want to deal with him again. So I finally got my curiosity overcame me, and I brought him back in, and I said, he looked good. I was surprised how good he looked. I mean, I thought he would be a wreck.
Yeah.
If they were that strong, I thought they would just be eating him up. And I told him that. I said, "You look good. I'm surprised." And he goes, "Well, I'm doing what you told me. They're not gaining any ground, but I haven't got rid of them either." So it was like a Mexican standoff he had with the voices. They were still there, but he was keeping them somewhat under control. And I asked him, I said, "Last time you were here, did you hear that crackling?" He goes, "Yeah, I heard it, but I'm surprised you did." Meaning me. And I said, "Yeah, I heard it. It lasted quite a while too." I said, "What was that?" He goes, "That was them." I said, "Them who? The voices?" He goes, "Yeah, they were the voices." And I said, "What in the blazes were they doing?" He said, "They were trying to scare you off." And I said, "Well, they did a damn good job of it." And then I asked him, I said, you looked weird when you walked out of here. You looked like a zombie." I said, "What were the voices telling you as you left my office?" He said, "They were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your gut."
Hmm.
And I went, "Well, he wouldn't do that. I've worked with him for 6 months. I know him pretty well. He wouldn't do that." And then I asked him, "Well, why didn't you do it?" And he said, "Well, I couldn't find one and nobody would give me one." And I'm like, ooh. So that frightened me because it was the first time that I saw, experienced personally, that they could affect physical reality.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
from that on, it was like, if they can do that, what else can they do?
Right. I bet all the hair stood up on the back of your neck when that was going on. I mean,
Yeah, it scared me half to death. And then it was like, what else can they do? It's clear that they're pissed at me. They don't like what I'm doing.
yeah.
Firing all these shots across my bow. They're making my office crackle like arc welder, for minutes. It was like, there was no denying it happened. So it's like I opened the door and it's like, okay, do I want to go in there?
Right.
But I didn't know the rules. I had no idea. There was no cognitive map whatsoever.
It's fascinating.
Well, I was fascinated, but
It's
I was
absolutely fascinating.
also scared.
Yep.
And if I
Yeah, because
wasn't,
you don't want to be energetically attacked.
no,
You don't need
no,
a voice inside your head
no.
like
And
they
I
have
was, I
brain.
was wondering, is that what's going to happen to me?
Yeah.
That all this weird stuff happen. Am I losing my mind? Am I going crazy? Because who was it? R.D. Lang or somebody who was experimenting with schizophrenics started acting pretty flaky as he started approaching these areas. You know.
Hmm.
So there was no cognitive map. There was no map. I think the only thing that kept me going was that I'm an adrenaline junkie. Had I not been an adrenaline junkie, I don't think I could have done this.
Yeah.
I really don't think that would have probably been the end of it. It was like, no, I don't want to go any further. But I kept pushing it, and that's what they are. They're demonic entities. They want that loose.
Yeah.
They attack everybody, not just the schizophrenics, everybody. And they attack by putting um, intrusive thoughts in your mind. So they're energetic. They're not physical. They're energetic. Your thoughts are energetic. Your uh, hearing is energetic. Your spirit's energetic. Your memory's energetic. You're an energetic being. If that energy leaves, you're dead. You're gone.
Right.
So these things can go into your mind. They can pull out every rotten thing you ever did, and they can start hammering at it, bring it into your consciousness if you don't realize what they're doing. They can cause you to misinterpret what people say. When something bad happens, they can jump on there and pour gasoline on the fire and make it worse.
Yeah.
But they're hitting us all. Every time you get a negative, intrusive thought, that's them. And they're much more evident in schizophrenics than they are in normal people. But the 50,000 people that kill themselves a year in the United States, they're not doing that without thinking about it. It's not like one day they wake up and just suddenly kill themselves.
Right.
they think about it,
Right.
they plan it, they contemplate it. It's really energetically draining. It's hard to kill yourself. You
And
know,
they're probably tortured,
yeah,
mentally tortured before they make that final decision to do that. Like a lot of the military vets,
yeah,
the suicide rate's really high,
yes.
you know?
So, what psychiatry is doing is like, you get a strong magnet, you got the magnetic field on there, and you can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't taste it, touch it, as far as we're concerned, it doesn't exist, you know, but you get some iron filings in a bottle and you put it on there. Now you can see the magnetic field there. It's not the magnetic field, but it's the outline of it. So you can actually see a representation of it. That's what these patterns are on my website under articles. Those 23 patterns are the magnetic, effect on those iron filings. They are the iron filings. They are the operational definition of what these entities are and how they behave and what they do. You can go there and you can look at it. Anybody who has a schizophrenic family member, you can go there and you can see these patterns and you'll see them for yourself. They're not buried in a biological disorder or genetics. They're right there.
Right.
And psychology has not done any experiments, any research on the voices at all. They dismiss them as hallucinations, and that's all there is to it.
They don't want to access the spiritual world, do they? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
They want nothing to do with it because they there's no way they can manipulate it. They can't test it.
They can't medicate it.
Well, they medicate the brain, but it doesn't get rid of the voices. It just weakens them. It numbs the brain and it slows it down. And the voices don't like the medications because they want the person as upset as they can get them. And the medications calm them down. So they weaken the voices because the voices can't feed on them as much.
Right.
So they do kind of ameliorate the symptoms, but they don't cure anything. And they're very destructive drugs. So when a psychiatrist says, well, it's a life sentence, and I've heard him say this to people, it's a life sentence. The only thing you can do, there's no cure for it, is just take our psychiatric drugs. That's all you can do. That's far from the truth. There's a lot of people who've recovered from it. They need to know what it is.
Right. Especially with Sherry. I mean, you guys put that in the book.
Yeah.
That's wonderful for everybody to be able to read and access. And I'm sure it's continuing ongoing information that's coming in too, because you have such a strong history in it. I mean, this MACE energy method too, that you're using.
The whole 40 some years that I've been on the front lines of mental health and psychology, nothing they taught us in graduate school, maybe except the experimental with the behavior modification. That worked.
Yeah.
But it's kind of rudimentary stuff. But when it comes to the mind and what's going on in the mind, nothing was there. There was nothing in graduate school, in the 6 years I spent in graduate school, that helped at all when I got onto the front lines. It was worthless. All these counseling theories didn't work. Nothing seemed to work with schizophrenics. Nothing seemed to work with any of them. You could talk to them until you're blue in the face. They might feel better for color after you talk to them, and then they go right back to feeling bad again. And so when I ran into MACE, it was like, wow, look at this stuff.
Can you describe that for the viewers, the people that aren't familiar with the MACE?
Yeah, MACE was developed by not a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, nobody in the field at all. It was developed by a ship captain, a master mariner named John Mace. And he eventually got his master's degree in counseling later on, but he was searching for a cure. What is it? What is the mind? And what is going wrong with people? The same questions I had, but he had a different approach. But so as a ship captain, as a master mariner driving these big freighters back and forth across the ocean, he had to know about electricity, had to know about magnetism. He had to know about magnetic fields. He had to know all this kind of scientific stuff, how electricity flowed. He saw that electricity flowed from the negative to the positive. And he's looking at the individual's energetic field. And he saw that people were energy units also, that there was positive and negative energy in people, that the spirit was the main positive energy coming into people, that these negative thoughts, he called them negative identities, were negative energy. Okay, so he's saying that regular counseling theories can't work because they don't recognize the identity of the person. But he says there's two kinds of identities that everybody has. They have a positive identity and a negative identity. The positive identity is, you may have a positive identity as a car driver. You don't have to think when you get in that car. It's not like when you were a brand new driver where you had to concentrate on every single thing you were doing. You get in the car and that positive identity drives that car while you're thinking about something else. It's virtually driving itself. You're on autopilot until something happens, and then you come back and you take over.
Yeah.
That's a positive identity. It helps you with your survival. You have a positive identity in whatever job you do. You may have a positive identity as a mother or a housewife or whatever you do for work. And those are all positive identities that help you survive on this planet. Negative identities were intended to help you survive during a crisis, but you make a decision during those crises, and they're not good decisions. You don't make good decisions during a crisis. So what happens during a crisis or a trauma is there's an awful feeling that comes about, and it overwhelms you. It's just, and it doesn't go away. It stays there forever. So based on that awful incident with the trauma, you make a decision about yourself in relation to that trauma. So if your dad did something really, really bad to you, you might decide and this is common, I'm worthless, I'm stupid. And that sticks with you. It's buried in your subconscious mind because it's so painful, you don't want to deal with it all the time. The ego shows up and goes, hey, I'll handle this for you. Takes it, buries it into the subconscious mind and locks it down. So it's buried alive. It's still there. It's not gone. And the way that affects you is when somebody shows up like your dad who abused you, who reminds you of your dad, that thing goes off. And it's telling you, get rid of that guy, attack him. He's making you feel bad, and there's no really conscious thing between him and your dad. It's just, it recognizes that that guy out there is like this in here, and we don't want you seeing or dealing with this in here. So get rid of that guy out there and this will go away. But the universe keeps sending you people like the person you hate. You keep showing up no matter where you go. There they are. You could go from here to China and that kind of person shows up and you go, oh God, there's another one,
And then they start dating them. No.
Yeah, that happens too. Alcoholics, they'll marry another alcoholic,
Right.
So that stays there. And the reaction is a fight or flight. You either fight that person or you run from them or you avoid them. In any case, every time they show up, there's an upset, there's a disturbance. And it can get quite violent at times. So the other way it shows up is like you get into a situation that's bad and you go, I'm never going to get into this situation again. Or I'll never marry another alcoholic. 6 months later, you're marrying another alcoholic. You don't even know it. Oh, he doesn't drink when I met him. He didn't drink for 6 months. Then the next thing you know, he's piling them down, It's like it recognizes, it's like so what the Mace energy system does is it goes after that buried trauma and it uses the spirit to find it. So at the end of the time where Mace already recognized that positive and negative identities were controlling our lives. Okay.
Yeah.
Wasn't worried about the positive identities. They were okay. They were doing what they're supposed to do, but the negative identities were buried. where were they buried? Where did the ego bury them in the subconscious mind? How are you going to find that? So he used the spirit to find that. It'd be like, okay, he would outline the characteristics of the negative identity. What is it composed of? Bang, bang, bang. It's all these different traits it's composed of. And then he'd say, okay, that's the negative identity. That's the body of negative energy jammed in there. That's its characteristics. He goes, now what does it look like? We found that the mind isn't what we think is the mind. He said the mind only takes pictures of where your attention is. It doesn't think, it doesn't feel, it doesn't analyze, it doesn't do any of the things we attribute to the mind. It just takes pictures of where you put your attention. You put your attention on whatever is around you, and it takes pictures of it, and you're seeing that, and then you move your attention somewhere and taking pictures of that. So what he found was, if you can turn those characteristics into a picture, okay, now that picture encompasses that negative identity. It's a representation. It's a psychological representation of that negative identity. That's negative energy. If you can connect up that negative energy with the positive energy, then that positive energy will drain it. Just like you drain a car battery. If you drain a car battery until it's completely dead, you can't ever, even a new car battery, you drain it till it's completely dead, you can't charge it up again. So what MACE does is it makes the connection between the negative and the positive energy. You have to use your concentration to hold it there. So if the person can't concentrate, it isn't going to work. If the person can't make an image, it's not going to work. But otherwise, the positive and the negative will move into the positive, and the positive will transform it to positive. And then that negative energy will be transformed to positive energy back where it belongs. This will be gone. You will no longer react to those kind of people when they show up in your psychic space. That negative identity will vanish. It's gone.
So
it will happen in as quick as an hour. So, what's so pathetic is I work with these people that are 60, 70 years old. At 70 years old, their mom told them, you're worthless, you're stupid, you're never going to amount to anything. And they incorporated that. It became a negative identity.
Right.
Carried that their entire lives. And here it is 70 years later, still there, still operational. They still feel that way. In an hour, it's gone. They can feel it gone. They no longer feel the same way. They feel lighter. They feel like they have more energy. And that thing is gone. So MACE gets rid of psychological problems. It goes to the cause. That's why they named the whole system causism.
So when they identify a negative identity, would you say like, would you call it like an emotion? Like, let's say anger or resentment. And then you just say, have the image in your mind of resentment, let's say, or anger. And then somehow the positive energy goes to that.
It's composed of it. So, you got the negative identity and you got how they feel about it.
Okay.
So the negative identity, and then what feeling did you have during that trauma? What was the most prevalent feeling you had during that trauma? That's what we're after. That's what we want to get rid of. Okay. So they go, well, I felt, I was very sad. I was very, depressed. Those were the salient feelings. Okay? So you got to get rid of the feelings too. So those feelings are also turned into an image and then connected to the spirit, and they are also absorbed. So here's something the guys carried around for 70, 75 years, and boom, it's gone in an hour. Completely.
Now, do you have to be, because I know a lot of people that are going to be viewing this are going to be wondering, do you have to be hooked up to a machine?
No.
You're talking about energy. Can this
No.
be done in person, over Zoom? I mean, how exactly is it verbal?
I do it over Zoom daily.
Okay.
And what's so interesting about this, because it's not a talk therapy, you're following instructions, and the therapist that's watching you to make sure that what's supposed to be happening is happening. So he's in contact with you as to what's happening with the image, what's happening with the identity. What are you seeing now? How far along is it? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is it? So he's in contact with you, but the therapist doesn't have to know anything about the trauma.
So they don't have to relive it. They don't have to
You have to
explain it to
relive
the
it.
therapist, right?
You do have to remember it for a short period of time. You have to remember what happened. You have to remember the feeling, but only for a short period of time.
And it's private for them, you know.
It's
'Cause
private for them.
I'm sure if somebody has sexual abuse, they don't want to have to relive it
Right.
over and over and over, even
Right.
though they have to have it in their mind for that moment. They don't have to share it publicly with their therapist or somebody else, because I'm sure they've probably already done that.
That's what's so fascinating about MACE is that the therapist doesn't have to know what the issue is.
Interesting.
All they have to know is where it happened and how you felt about it.
So how do you treat it? How do you treat these demonic entities, these parasites, the psychic energy with that then? I mean,
That's
because you're
a
like
whole,
hunting it out in the body.
that's a whole different deal there. Is even if we can't get rid of the voices, we can get rid of the trauma that they feed off of. All right. So sometimes I think, the person has a negative entity, and then we run it, and it turned out to be a negative identity, and then it's gone. Sometimes I think it's a negative identity, and it turns out to be an entity, and the entity's interfering. It's like they can't concentrate, they can't form an image, they can't think straight, they have headache, they get a stomach ache. The entities doesn't want this to happen.
Right.
But
Interesting.
even if we don't get rid of the entity, we can get rid of all the trauma that it feeds off of, and that will weaken it.
Yeah. And that's huge for anybody, whether they have an entity or not.
Right.
That's pretty amazing.
Everybody's got trauma.
Right. A lot.
Yeah.
On this world, everyone has a lot of trauma. That's for sure. And I wanted to ask you also about uh, the psychic parasitic entities in children, because I know I'm a psychic and I have a lot of friends that are psychics, and we're seeing an uptick in children that are being demonically possessed. Like we actually see it in their eyes. This will be completely black, or just their behavior, or for my friends that are clairvoyant, they can actually see the entity either in them or on them as an attachment. And I was just wondering, I know you deal mostly with adults, but I just wanted to get your feedback about children. What have you seen them? Have you treated them? Any signs that stand out to you?
I was doing psychological evaluations on them when I was working in the emergency rooms. The 10 years I spent doing psych crisis in emergency rooms, and I was surprised at how many of them there were. I didn't think there was anywhere near as many as I was encountering. And all I can tell you is, again, you got the trauma,
Right.
but the voices, these entities hate children. They absolutely hate them. They can't stand children. I think that's why all this child sexual abuse is going on, this child torture. The U.S., it's sickening. The U.S. is one of the biggest child traffickers on the planet right now. It's just absolutely sickening.
Yeah.
These kids are being destroyed.
That's horrific. Yeah. It's everywhere. Yep. And with the elites, it's everywhere. So what do you see? I guess, so when they came into the emergency rooms, how did you treat them? Or have you done any children with the mace? I'm just curious as to how responsive they are with that.
I didn't know Mace at the time that I was working in the emergency room. I didn't even know it existed. But yeah, kids are responsive with Mace. They're fairly easy to deal with. And yeah, it works on anybody who can form an image. It'll work. If you can't form an image, it won't work. But that's a minority of people. I've only run into one or two in 3 years that couldn't form an image.
Okay.
So,
Fascinating.
if you want to, all you guys out there listening, before you even think about taking psychiatric drugs, please find a MACE practitioner. You can go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. You can sign up there, or you can go to causisminstitute.com and see if you can find a MACE practitioner there.
Absolutely.
Before you, heaven's sake, before you start taking these toxic psychiatric drugs, try MACE. It actually works. It gets rid of psychological problems. Most psychological problems it will get rid of.
And just lessening that feeling of trauma, you know, that stored memory. I mean, that's huge for anybody, you know?
Yeah, people say they feel lighter. You know, they feel bigger. They feel they have more energy. You know, and they sometimes they get a little confused because they don't feel the same anymore. You know, that negative energy they've been dragging around for decades is gone.
How many sessions does it usually take for someone?
It usually takes about 3,
3?
depending on how bad off they are.
Yeah.
Some people just want one. You know, they want to get rid of the main one. So you know, there's sessions for the rune. They call it the rune, which is this is the one that destroyed your life. You know, this is the negative identity that caused you the most grief in your life, that changed you for the worst. You know, getting rid of that one first, and then there's specific techniques for relationships, for dealing with bad relationships.
So to maybe break someone out of a pattern that's having bad relationships, or just, okay.
Patterns, or whether they're having trouble with their boyfriend or their husband or their girlfriend, or if they had major trauma from their dad or their mother or somebody else.
Yeah.
It will release that negative energy. So they'll remember what happened, but there won't be any emotional reaction to it. It'll be like, okay, you know, I remember that happened, you know, I'm done with it. There's
They
no,
finally processed it.
it's gone. It's out of their universe.
Yeah. That's wonderful. That is wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up here? Is there anything that I left out? Because I know that
Yeah, I could have gone on forever, but
I want you to.
like
I know you've got plans.
I'm like, yeah, I'm late now.
I'll have to ask you back if that's okay.
Well, sure.
I'd love to have you back on.
Matter of fact, I can bring on some people who've experienced some of this stuff.
That'd be great. I'd love that. Well, I just want to say thank you very much. It was an honor to have you here. I was so excited to really bring you on today, because I think the work that you've done and what you're continuing to do with the MACE is so important, and the information needs to get out there. And I'm going to have Jerry's contact information in the description below. Please reach out to him if you or someone you know needs help, or you'd like to have a MACE treatment. And I also want to say, I want to bring up your book, and I'm going to show a picture of it. I'm going to post that later, but your book is on Amazon. It's got almost 5 stars. I think it's 4.7 last time I looked, but you're in English, French, German, Spanish. I mean, really, you have a big audience for this. You're really out there in the forefront. So I just want to say thank you again. I appreciate you being on, and I hope to have you back.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. If it's not one for people like you, I'd be a voice screaming out in the middle of the desert at night.
Well, we're definitely going to have you back, because we are definitely going to dive deep into the demonic possession next time. We're really focused on that.
Well,
And
I have some poems written by a psychotic killer here I can bring up.
I think that'd be great. Because it really gives you insight into the mind.
Yeah.
You know,
It does.
and the voices.
Uh-huh.
Yep. All right, Jerry. Well, hey, thank you so much for being here today.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Send me a link when you have one.
I definitely will.
Okay. Take care.
You too. Bye.